Welcome back to Two Pretty Good Bad Men, an Alias Smith & Jones podcast. I'm your beloved host, Tabitha, and dear listeners, we have made it to the end of Season 1. I am so proud of us. Today we are covering Episode 15, the season finale, called The Legacy of Charlie O'Rourke. This episode was shot at the end of March through the beginning of April 1971, and it aired April 2nd, 1971. But before we get into it, I realized that while I briefly go through the careers of the writers, the directors, and the guest stars of this series, I haven't actually done it for our leads. So since it is the season finale, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the life and careers of Pete Duel and Ben Murphy. At least, Ben Murphy's up to Alias Smith & Jones. His post-Smith & Jones career I'll get into later. Pete Duel was born the oldest of 3 children in Rochester, New York. He came from a long line of doctors on his father's side, but his parents supported him when he wanted to go into acting instead. From everything I've read, the family was very close. In interviews I've read with Pete, he always spoke lovingly of his parents, his brother, his sister, and his niece. He loved the outdoors, and he hiked and he camped out as much as he could. Even when making the move to LA, he didn't sleep in motels, he just set up a tent whenever he was tired. Initially, he had his young heart set on a career in aviation. He wanted to be an Air Force pilot. Sadly, those dreams came crashing down when he failed his eye exam. He also had epilepsy, which certainly would keep him out of the cockpit. After high school, he went to New York and performed in shows like The Rose Tattoo and Born Yesterday. He took a role in the National Touring Company production of Take Her, She's Mine. After that, he decided to leave New York for Los Angeles. He found guest work on 12 O'Clock High, Combat, and Gomer Pyle USMC. In 1965, he landed the role on the Sally Field sitcom Gidget. He played John, Gidget's brother-in-law. I'll talk more about that show at a later date. It only lasted 1 season, but when it was over, Pete was immediately picked up for another sitcom called Love on a Rooftop as David Willis. And we've already talked about that show. It, too, only lasted 1 season, despite favorable reviews from critics. After that, he signed a 7-year contract with Universal and continued to do guest spots on television and get small parts in some features, like To Hell with Heroes and Generations. He starred in some TV movies like How to Steal an Airplane, which I've talked extensively about, but what I didn't know was that it was a potential pilot movie that didn't get picked up. He also starred in the TV movie called The Young Country with Roger Davis, and I'll get to that later. He was guest starring on shows like Marcus Welby, The Bold Ones, The Lawyers, and The Psychiatrists. He did 2 episodes of The Name of the Game, one of them with his brother Jeffrey. By the accounts I've read, Pete was enjoying this period in his career. He was getting to play a variety of characters, and in fact, his role in The Psychiatrist was his favorite. He didn't really want to do Alias Smith & Jones, but he was under contract. He was in a televised play for the show Hollywood Television Theater called Scarecrow, based off Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story Feathertop. His co-stars were Gene Wilder, Blythe Danner, and Norman Lloyd. It aired just a couple of weeks after his death. He died by suicide on December 31st, 1971. I'm not going to get into the events surrounding his death and what happened to the show afterwards just yet. I will cover all that eventually. For now, I'll just say I think he was a very talented and charming actor, and I'm very sorry that it happened. When I first saw Ben Murphy, I was sure I'd seen him in something before, but it turns out no, he just looks a lot like Paul Newman. Ben Murphy was born in Arkansas and spent his early childhood with his grandparents in Tennessee. His father died when he was very young, and his mother later remarried. Ben took his stepfather's last name, and the family eventually moved to a suburb outside of Chicago. His only sibling, a brother named Timothy, was born when Ben was 15. I get that. All my siblings are 10 to 14 years younger than me. You don't have a normal sibling relationship when you're that far apart in age. You're off doing their thing while they're still kids stuck in school and in the house with the parents. Tragically, Timothy was killed while rock climbing in 1984. Ben went to a bunch of different colleges, from Iowa to New Orleans to Mexico City to Chicago again. He cared about his education, but he also wanted to avoid the draft, too, and he is so real for that, nothing but respect. He loves history and keeping up with politics and political science. That's what he majored in before his interest turned to acting. He got a small role in the drama department's production of Julius Caesar and discovered that he loved it. Once he graduated, he headed for Hollywood. His first IMDb role is an uncredited part in The Graduate. Then he was in It Takes a Thief, thank Christ. He played the boyfriend of one of the daughters in Yours, Mine, and Ours with Lucille Ball and Henry Fonda. And Okay, I guess I did see that when I was a child, but there's no way I remembered him from it. No offense, Ben. Then he had a recurring role on The Name of the Game as Robert Stack's sidekick, assistant, something like that. He did guest work on the Virginian Medical Center and the Mod Squad. Pete Duell was specifically chosen for Hannibal Hayes, but Ben Murphy had to audition, and he wasn't the favorite by any means. Luckily, he was able to test with Pete and the chemistry just clicked. The producers saw it, and Ben got the role of Kid Curry. Ben's career definitely continued long after ASGA, but again, I'll get to that later. Like, maybe the last episode. Everybody got all that? I hope that was sufficient for the time being. Okay, let's get back to the legacy of Charlie O'Rourke. The story was by Robert Guy Barrows, and the teleplay was by Dick Nelson. It was directed by Jeffrey Hayden. Dick Nelson has already been with us twice, writing Stagecoach 7 and The Journey from San Juan. Director Jeffrey Hayden has also already worked a great deal on the show. He directed Wrong Train to Brimstone, A Fistful of Diamonds, The Man Who Murdered Himself, and Journey from San Juan. Hey, it's a Journey from San Juan reunion, yay! Robert Guy Barrows, on the other hand, is new here, and he's a one and done, sadly. He brought the idea for this episode to Roy Huggins, and Huggins handed it to Nelson to write the teleplay. Barrows was a television writer, but he actually has a pretty small IMDb page, and this episode of ASJ is his last credit. His first credit was for a short-lived western called Destry. He also worked with Huggins on Run for Your Life and The Fugitive. Other westerns he worked on include Bonanza, The Big Valley, Daniel Boone, and The Virginia. He was also a playwright and author. Let's talk guest stars. First up is Joan Hackett as Alice Banyan. She worked on shows like Gunsmoke, Dr. Kildare, and The Twilight Zone. She was in the movie Support Your Local Sheriff with James Garner. She was also in the TV movie with Pete Duell and Roger Davis, The Young Country. The Young Country was kind of a dry run for ASJ. Some people call it the original pilot. I don't think it's that close. She did a Curtis Harrington TV movie called How Awful About Alan with poor typecast Anthony Perkins and Julie Harris. Later in her career, she was on shows like Trapper John, The Love Boat, and Taxi. Unfortunately, she passed away young at only 49 of ovarian cancer. We have the return of J.D. Cannon as Harry Briscoe. Originally in this episode, he was meant to be a brand new character, but Huggins and producer Joe Swerling really liked both the character of Briscoe, to each their own I suppose, and the actor Cannon. I'm sure he was a great guy. My ambivalence towards Briscoe has nothing to do with Cannon. Next is Billy Green Bush as the titular Charlie O'Rourke. He was in some fantastic movies like 5 Easy Pieces, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and The Hitcher. Of course, he was also in Critters and Jason Goes to Hell the Final Friday. They can't all be winners. We gotta make money, don't we? On the television front, he worked on MASH, The FBI, The Rookies, The Streets of San Francisco, and Hill Street Blues. He did the episode Moonshine of Starsky and Hutch along with Dennis Fimple. He was also in an episode of The A-Team. I have to bring that up. He retired from acting in 2001. And finally, we've got Guy Raymond as Sheriff Carver. He was in the best episode of Star Trek, and I'm being serious this time, The Trouble with Tribbles. He was also in the Natalie Wood movie, Gypsy. He was in a short-lived Jack Klugman show called Harris Against the World. He worked on Hazel, Green Acres, The Beverly Hillbillies, Here Come the Brides, Maude, Lou Grant, and Little House on the Prairie. And after all that, we still have an episode to talk about. Our sneak peek sees the boys and a woman walking through the desert. The woman says she can't go on any further. Kid tells her not to worry because Hayes always thinks of a plan, right? Hayes says the plan is to die. And the kid says he knew he'd think of something. After the opening credits, the boys ride into town and are immediately called to by a man in a jail cell. They rush over to him to shut him up before he gives their identities away. The man is Charlie O'Rourke. He thinks they showed up to witness his execution that's scheduled for the next day. But he soon finds out that they don't like him that much, and their being in town is just a coincidence. I will say he is in very high spirits for someone about to be killed. The sheriff lets Smith and Jones into the jail cell so they can properly visit with him. He tells them that he made off with $100,000 in gold bars. He buried it in the desert before a posse caught up with him. You know, if the A-Team has taught me anything, it's that gold is heavy. How was he transporting it alone through the desert with the posse on his trail? Anyway, he'd be happy to tell the boys where it's hidden, but Hayes doesn't want to because it's stolen and it would be a crime to take it. They tell Charlie about their amnesty deal. Charlie tells him that people died in the robbery and 3 from the posse were killed. That's why he's been sentenced to death. And if they don't want to know where the gold is, he'll just take it to the grave. That seems kind of petty to me. He drops his bravado just for a moment and requests that they actually show up for the hanging. The boys head to the saloon feeling down about the situation, but before they get inside, Harry Briscoe comes out, thrilled to see them. Here we go again with this guy. You may remember him as the Bannerman detective from The Wrong Train to Brimstone. They make nice with him, hoping to shake him off, but Briscoe says he'll buy them a drink later on. Once he leaves, they head into the saloon and are watched by the woman from the sneak peek. The bartender says their drinks are on the house because they're friends of Charlie. Kind of strange, but they brush it off. Then Briscoe shows up again and says no, actually their drinks are on him. He's got more to talk about with them. Once again, Hayes' hair looks fantastic this episode. Hayes, can I call you Hannibal? What type of conditioner do you use? Once the trio are at a private table, Briscoe says the sheriff told them that they had a little talk with Charlie, and he's now convinced that they know the location of the gold. Very little can dissuade him from this notion, I'm just warning you now. He says Charlie must have sent for them. There's no way they just happened to ride into the same town, right? That would be almost contrived, wouldn't it? Briscoe says that his friendship and his job are at odds, and if need be, he'll choose his job. Aww. Briscoe thinks that the boys are his friends? That's sad. But then he threatens him, so now it's not so sad anymore. Right after Briscoe leaves, the woman who had been watching them, Alice Banyan, drops a note on their table to come see her in her room. Just as she descends in a human-sized bird cage and sings. Oh, more singing. Please, no more singing. Although I do prefer this to Michelle's whisper voice. Alice's hair is pretty great, too. She and Hayes should compare hair care notes. The guys are all too happy to accept her invitation. In her room, they sip tea while Alice changes. She tells them the sad story about how she was on her way to San Francisco, hoping to open a saloon and dance hall of her own. But she ran out of money and ended up in the town of Browntown for the last 18 months. This seems to keep happening to people on this show. Doesn't anyone know how to budget before a trip to make sure they can actually reach their destination? Sadly for the boys, she didn't ask them to her room for sexy times. She wants to start a partnership with them in San Francisco because she thinks that they know where Charlie's gold is. Everybody thinks that now. With heavy hearts and blue balls, they leave. That night, Alice goes to visit Charlie, and it looks like he's chosen half a watermelon for his last meal. Alice says she thought if he had someone to talk to and sing with, it might make his last night alive easier. That would be nice, but we know that she's actually there to get the location of the gold out of him. And I'm sorry, but that is gross. This man is about to be executed, and she can't work up any real compassion for him. She just wants something from him. If he didn't know where $100,000 was, there's no way she'd show up to sing for him. I understand that people died due to his actions, but it just seems really wrong to go to a condemned man and ask if she can have his blood money. Anyway, she does sing for him, and it's pretty melancholy. Charlie's situation looks to be really hitting him, and he looks sad and resigned, and he's almost in tears, but he fights them off and keeps on eating his watermelon, and it's honestly kind of heartbreaking. Billy Green Bush does a great job conveying emotions with just his face in this scene. The scene changes to Charlie's funeral, where there's only a few people in attendance, including Hayes and the kid. Alice's song plays over the scene. It's a very well done and tragic bit of work. I hope Hayes and the kid were there for the hanging, so at least Charlie felt like he had some friends near him at the end. And now for some mood whiplash. The boys get carried off into, I think it's the livery stable. Maybe. By a couple of guys. The door shuts and we hear a humorous fight ensue. Then the boys emerge, disheveled but victorious. They head right for the saloon, drag out Harry Briscoe, and dunk him in the trough. He sent the two men to beat the location of the gold out of him. They drag him back into the saloon, and he's got, a towel wrapped around his head, and his drink is shaking in his hand like he just went over a waterfall. Dude, you got what amounts to, an old-time swirly. Calm down, I think you're gonna live. He said the company who lost the money offered a reward for recovering it. It's $5,000. Doesn't sound nearly as good as $100,000, but, it's something. Hayes insists that Charlie again did not tell them where the gold is. Briscoe says fine, but Alice probably knows since she spent hours with Charlie the night before. This is news to the boys. He plays on their chivalry and says that she'll probably be in danger once word gets around that she knows where it is. They're still on the fence, so he tells them he now believes they aren't Smith and Jones. He believes that they're outlaws. He just doesn't know which ones. Really? You don't know which ones? Maybe the ones whose descriptions they match and who gave you wildly different ones the last time you met to throw you off the trail? Did that occur to you? So they go to Alice and tell her they want to help her with the gold. She's suspicious about their change of heart, and they finally bring up the fact that $100,000 in gold will be extremely heavy to move. They don't even make it through what has obviously been a well-rehearsed speech before she's like, okay, let's go. They leave on a stage, and then we see the sheriff telling his posse that he'll follow them about a half a mile behind. When they stop at a relay station, and the driver and other passengers get out, Hayes gets in the driver's seat and takes off with the kid and Alice. Alice is panicking, saying there's no way they can outrun a posse in a stagecoach. At the station, the sheriff says they don't even have to hurry, because of course they can't outrun them in a stagecoach. And even if they do, the stage will leave a trail that he could follow in his sleep. You fool! Do you not think Hannibal Hayes is 2 steps ahead of you? Ha ha! Idiot. Hayes pulls the stage to a stop so the 3 of them jump off, and he sends the stage off on its own. The horses will keep going for a few miles before they'll realize that nobody's making them go anymore. And that's all they need. They duck behind some brush as the stupid idiot posse runs past them. Hayes wishes he could be there to see the sheriff's face when he stops an empty stage. Alice asks if either of them actually know what they're doing, and Hayes just smiles at her. There's something weird going on with Alice's voice, too. She sounds like she's been badly dubbed. Like, the boys sound normal and like they're actually in the scene. Alice sounds like maybe Joan Hackett had to go redub all her dialogue for some reason. It's much louder than Hayes and the kid, and it just doesn't remotely sound like it's in the same location. Kid gets some horses from Briscoe, who is waiting nearby for them. He tells them they'll see him back in town for about a week. But can Briscoe be trusted? Nope. No, he cannot. The 3 horses, they ride off into the desert. Eventually, Alice notices that they're being followed. Hayes and the kid go back to take a look, and she tells them to be careful because she doesn't want anything happening to them. That's sweet. I think she actually means it. Still, she's no dummy and has a pair of binoculars on her. The boys ride back, and sure enough, Harry Briscoe's been following them. He says he's got to make sure they follow through with the plan. They argue that if Alice gets suspicious, she won't lead them to the gold. He agrees to go away, but will he? No, he will not. When they get back to Alice, she confronts them about working with Briscoe. They tell her they couldn't let her steal the gold because she'll be running for the rest of her life. And Hayes very sincerely tells her that they know what that's like, and it's just no way to live. And she believes them. They ask if she'd be willing to settle for 1/3 of the $5,000 reward. Hey Siri, what's 1/3 of $5,000? About $1,600? I don't know much about math, but that sounds like a lot less than $5,000. She agrees anyway and keeps leading them to the gold. They get to a general area and she says that Charlie told her the gold would be under a Joshua trees. Right in the middle of like a million Joshua trees. But they still find the gold. Alice hugs them both and they start hauling the gold over to the horses. She says she could quite possibly fall in love with them, but she couldn't choose. Hayes says they'll flip a coin for her. Boys, stop doing that. I don't like it. Just then, Briscoe shows up and holds them up at gunpoint, takes the gold and the horses. Yes, really. He decided $100,000 was his price to turn crook. This is his Breaking Bad moment. Briscoe, you suck. He leaves them one canteen and says they'll probably make it to a town, but he'll have time to get across the border. I hate him. He even laughs maniacally as he's riding away. What the fuck? The trio start walking. Then we're back at our sneak peek. I know you have to protect your skin from the sun, but isn't Alice wearing like 7 layers? I would have at least torn off the long sleeves of that dress. Just as they're about to implement Hayes' brilliant plan of waiting for death, a random German guy shows up and asks what they're doing out there. This man, Kurt Schmidt, has horses and a wagon and cooks for them. Alice gushes over his culinary skills, and as he's telling her his story, we drift away from him over to Hayes and the kid. But wait, I actually want to know what this guy's doing there. I'm curious. Hayes and the kid inspect his horses. His huge horses. They know they won't go fast, but they should be able to catch Briscoe, since all that gold will slow him down. They ask Kurt if they can borrow them. He negotiates that they divide the 5K 4 ways. Hey Siri, what's 1/4 of 5K? About 1,200. Poor boys. But hey, at least he's not charging them extra to borrow his rifles. Alice is impressed by Kurt's business mind. So the boys set out after Briscoe. Briscoe is having himself a little break and practicing his Spanish. He spots the boys coming and starts shooting at them. They end up in the rocks, and while Briscoe with 2 guns is firing on Hayes, the kid gets the jump on him and Briscoe surrenders. Of course, they want to turn him in, but Briscoe gets out of it by figuring out, magically, that they're Hannibal Hayes and Kid Curry. How many times has this happened to them? Briscoe offers to divide up the $100K, and they can all go their own ways, and he'll just continue on to Mexico. But the boys aren't about that life. They're taking the gold back and settling for the reward. He's stunned that they're willing to do that. They agree they won't tell anyone what Briscoe did so long as he leaves the gold to them and doesn't tell anyone who they are. It's a deal. In the tag, Hayes gives Alice and Kurt their share of the reward. Apparently, while the boys were risking life and limb going after Briscoe, they decided to partner up. They're going to San Francisco together. I like Kurt in the 2 scenes he's in. He seems like a pretty chill guy. Alice says goodbye to the boys and kisses them both. Lucky woman. She says she'll always wonder what would have happened if she'd met them one at a time. And then she and Kurt ride away. The boys lost the girl, but they did get $2,500. That's something. And then they start up with the, we should flip a coin next time we meet a woman like her. I told you to stop that nonsense, boys. Women are not your prizes. We get a lovely shot of Hayes' beautiful profile, and then the boys ride away to the next adventure. And that is a wrap on season 1. I really like this episode. It has a lot of great lines. Alice is a fun character, and even though I'm not a Harry Briscoe fan, he did get a few laughs out of me. It took the time to really let Charlie's situation sink in with the audience, and it managed to make me feel sympathy for him and his limited screen time. It's a really strong episode to end the season on. And the line of the episode, honestly, it's tied between Alice and Briscoe. The first one is from Alice right after the boys go to her room the first time. Hayes says that they weren't sure which one of them the note was for. Alice says, why, both of you, of course. You do chaperone each other, don't you? And the Briscoe line is right after he sees them catching up at the end, and he says, too kind-hearted, that's my trouble. The episode goes to, I'm gonna say the kid. Only because I think Hayes made a real error in judgment by not letting Charlie tell them where the gold was in the first place. That would have saved them so much trouble. He could have simply just told the sheriff from the start. Next time on Alias Smith & Jones, it's the return of Wheat and Kyle, and the kid is getting hanged for murder? Research for this podcast comes mainly from the wonderful book Alias Smith & Jones, The Story of Two Pretty Good Bad Men, by Sandra K. Segala and Joanne M. Bagwell. Thanks for listening.